They called themselves HOA officers. They wore fake badges. They came for my dog. I was a decorated veteran. I had done nothing wrong. Then they made one fatal mistake. What happened next destroyed her entire life. My name is Marcus Bennett, 38 years old, a former Army combat medic who served 2 tours before coming home to Cedar Hollow, Georgia. I bought my house with VA benefits and sweat equity, refinishing the floors myself. My rescue dog, Duke, a broad-shouldered mixed breed with a limp from a shelter injury, was the only creature who understood my nightmares. Life in Cedar Hollow was quiet before her. I worked as a physical therapist at the VA clinic, coached Little League on weekends, and kept my lawn edged sharper than most. Duke and I walked the same loop every evening past manicured hedges and pastel mailboxes. I thought I had finally found peace. I was wrong. Deborah Whitfield ran the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association like a personal kingdom. She'd been board president for 11 years, re-elected unopposed because nobody wanted the headache of challenging her. Neighbors joked that she measured grass blades with a ruler. I laughed along with them back then, not knowing I'd soon be her next target. The first sign of trouble came 6 weeks after I moved in. Deborah appeared at my door unannounced, clipboard in hand, eyeing Duke through the screen. "That's a big dog for a small lot," she said. Not really a question. I told her Duke was gentle as a lamb. She wrote something down and left without another word. Within days, a violation notice appeared in my mailbox, citing an overgrown flower bed I hadn't even planted yet. I paid the $50 fine without complaint, chalking it up to overzealous bureaucracy. My neighbor Ellis, an older widower 2 doors down, warned me quietly over the fence. "She does this," he said. "Pick someone new every year." I didn't understand yet why I'd become that someone. I kept to myself, mowed on schedule, and even volunteered to repaint the community sign after a storm damaged it. Deborah thanked me publicly at a meeting, all smiles for the cameras. Behind that smile, something colder was already forming, though I couldn't yet see it. Duke, meanwhile, was becoming the neighborhood's unofficial mascot. Kids ran up to pet him on our walks. He never once growled at a soul. He'd survived 3 years chained in a backyard before rescue volunteers found him starving, and I'd spent a year rebuilding his trust in people. He trusted everyone now. That trust would soon be weaponized against us. The Cedar Hollow bylaws capped dogs at 50 pounds without a special waiver. Duke weighed 62. I'd registered him properly at move-in. Disability accommodation paperwork included, since he helped ground me during flashbacks. The management company had approved it in writing. I kept that letter in a drawer, never imagining I'd need to defend my own dog's existence. Deborah's husband had died 2 years earlier, leaving her the biggest house on Magnolia Court and, according to Ellis, a mountain of unpaid medical bills she hid behind expensive landscaping. She controlled the HOA's reserve fund alone. No co-signatures required. Nobody had audited the books in 9 years. That detail would matter enormously, though none of us knew it yet. At the spring meeting, Deborah proposed tightening the pet weight limit for community safety. She never mentioned my name, but every head in the room turned toward me anyway. I raised my hand and read my accommodation letter aloud. She smiled thinly and said the board would take it under advisement. The vote never happened that night. 2 weeks later, I found Duke's accommodation letter missing from the HOA's official file when I requested a copy for my records. The management company clerk, a nervous young man named Petey, admitted Deborah kept certain sensitive documents in her own home office instead of the shared cabinet. I asked why. I started keeping copies of everything after that, scanning every letter, every email, every fine notice into a folder on my laptop. My late father, a postal worker for 30 years, always said paperwork was the only language bureaucracies respected. I didn't know yet how right he'd turn out to be, or how much paperwork I'd eventually need. Ellis told me over coffee that Deborah had once forced a young couple to sell their house after a 2-year fight over a basketball hoop. Another family left after she fined them weekly for a wind chime she called excessive noise. Nobody fought back long. They just left. Why the neighborhood felt so unnervingly silent. I asked Ellis why nobody had ever challenged her for the board seat. He laughed bitterly. "Stu," he said. "Mails them out herself. Counts them herself." I filed that away. Another loose thread in a pattern I was only beginning to see. One that would eventually unravel her entire operation. By early summer, the fines against me had reached 4 in 2 months. Each one petty. Each one paid promptly to avoid escalation. Deborah began greeting me on our walks with exaggerated politeness that felt more like surveillance than kindness. "Big dog like that," she'd say, eyes narrowing at Duke. "Someone's bound to get hurt eventually." I should have recognized that comment as a threat rather than small talk. Instead, I brushed it off, telling myself paranoia wasn't worth the energy after everything Duke and I had survived together. Looking back, that comment was the opening move in a campaign that would nearly cost me my home, my dog, and my peace of mind. The real spark came on a Tuesday in July. Duke and I were walking past the community pool when a boy named Tyler, maybe 9 years old, darted out chasing a soccer ball and collided with Duke's leash, tumbling onto the grass. Duke never touched him. He simply sat down, confused, tail thumping nervously against the sidewalk. Tyler wasn't hurt, just startled, and even laughed once he caught his breath, patting Duke's head before running off to retrieve his ball. I thought nothing more of it. But Deborah had been watching from her porch across the street the entire time. Phone already raised, recording an angle that made the collision look far worse. 3 days later, an official HOA incident report arrived at my door, alleging that my aggressive, unregistered dog had attacked a minor child. It cited Deborah as the sole witness.
It demanded Duke be surrendered to animal control for a safety evaluation.
I called Tyler's mother immediately, half expecting a confrontation. Instead, she sounded confused and apologetic. "Duke didn't attack anyone," she said. "Tyler ran into him. That's all. He wasn't even scared." She promised to write a statement clearing Duke's name, relief flooding through me for the first time in days. I thanked her. I submitted the mother's signed statement to the HOA management office the very next morning, certain the matter would be dropped instantly. Instead, Petey the clerk told me, voice lowered, that Deborah had personally intercepted the file before it reached the official record. "She said she'd handle it herself," he whispered. That phrase would haunt me for weeks. A week passed with no further contact, and I let myself hope it was over, That reason had somehow prevailed. Then a certified letter arrived, informing me that the HOA's newly formed Compliance and Safety Committee had scheduled a mandatory hearing regarding Duke's documented history of aggression. I had never heard of this committee before that moment. I researched Cedar Hollow's bylaws that night and found no mention of any Compliance and Safety Committee anywhere in the governing documents. I called the management company directly. The regional manager, a woman named Priya, sounded startled. "We never approved a new committee," she said carefully. "Let me look into that and call you back." Priya never called back that week, and my calls went straight to voicemail. Meanwhile, a laminated notice appeared taped to community mailboxes announcing the committee's formation, listing Deborah as chairperson and two names I didn't recognize as certified HOA enforcement officers. Certified by whom? Exactly. Nobody could say. The wording alone made my stomach turn. I mentioned the notice to Ellis, who squinted at a photo I'd taken on my phone. "Enforcement officers," he muttered. "This is a homeowners association, not the sheriff's department." He'd lived in Cedar Hollow for 18 years and had never once heard of any authority beyond fines and the occasional lawsuit. Something had fundamentally changed here. That night I began researching HOA law in Georgia, staying up past midnight reading statutes on a laptop balanced on my knees while Duke slept against my leg. Associations could fine, place lien, and in extreme cases sue. They could not, under any circumstance, seize personal property or claim law enforcement authority. Deborah was building something illegal. I decided to attend the hearing anyway, determined to bring every document I had: the accommodation letter, the mother's statement, screenshots of the fabricated committee notice. I wanted a paper trail proving I'd complied with every reasonable request while Deborah manufactured a crisis. My hands shook slightly as I organized the folder that morning. The hearing was held in the clubhouse, a cramped room with folding chairs arranged like a courtroom. Deborah seated behind a table with a gavel she had no legal authority to wield. Two unfamiliar men flanked her, wearing navy polo shirts embroidered with HOA enforcement in gold thread. My pulse quickened at the sight of them. I presented my evidence calmly, reading Tyler's mother's statement aloud, showing the accommodation letter, explaining Duke's documented temperament assessment from his rescue organization. Deborah listened with a tight, patient smile, the kind adults give children mid-tantrum. When I finished, she simply said, "Noted," and moved directly to a vote among her hand-picked panel. The vote, unsurprisingly, went against me 3-0. Deborah announced that Duke would be classified as a conditionally dangerous animal, pending surrender for a state-mandated behavioral evaluation, effective in 7 days. I asked which state agency required this. She said the committee would coordinate directly with animal control. No agency name was ever provided. Walking home from that hearing, I felt something shift inside me. The same cold clarity I remembered from deployments when a situation stopped being confusing and started being clear. This wasn't about safety or bylaws anymore. This was one woman deciding she could simply take what she wanted from a neighbor who wouldn't fight back easily. I called a lawyer that same evening, a local attorney named Renata Osei who specialized in HOA disputes and veterans' housing rights. She listened to the entire story without interrupting once, then asked a single question that reframed everything for me. Has anyone on this so-called committee shown you actual government-issued identification or authority? The answer, of course, was no. Renata explained that impersonating law enforcement or claiming government authority you don't possess could constitute criminal impersonation under Georgia law, not just a civil HOA violation. She agreed to represent me for a modest retainer, and for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without nightmares. Renata sent Deborah a formal cease and desist letter within 48 hours, demanding the fabricated committee be dissolved and all disciplinary action against Duke suspended pending review of the HOA's actual governing documents. She CC'd the management company and Georgia's Real Estate Commission for good measure. I felt, for the first time, like I had leverage. Deborah's response arrived not through legal channels but through a new wave of petty fines. An unregistered garden gnome. Grass cut a quarter-inch too short. A trash can left out 4 hours past pickup. 5 citations in 5 days. Each one $200. Each one time-stamped to the minute Renata's letter had been received. I photographed everything before paying nothing, following Renata's advice to dispute each fine in writing and let the paper trail grow. She explained that harassment campaigns like this often escalated before they collapsed, and that Deborah's own aggression, documented and dated, would eventually become our strongest evidence. I just had to survive the escalation first. Word began spreading through Cedar Hollow that I was fighting the HOA, and reactions split sharply. Some neighbors avoided eye contact entirely, afraid of becoming Deborah's next target by association. Others, quietly, began leaving notes in my mailbox, small confessions of their own past run-ins with her, each one adding another piece to a growing pattern. One note came from a woman named Carla, who'd left Cedar Hollow 2 years earlier after Deborah fined her family into near bankruptcy over a shed permit dispute that later turned out to be entirely legal. Carla wrote that she still had every document from her case and would gladly share them if it helped stop this happening again. I met Carla for coffee that weekend, and she brought a thick binder of her own evidence, including something that made my blood run cold, photographs of the same. 2 men in Navy HOA enforcement polos who'd flanked Deborah at my hearing, standing outside Carla's old house 2 years earlier, doing the exact same routine. Carla had done some digging of her own back then and discovered the badges those men wore were ordered from a novelty security supply website, the kind marketed for costume parties and prank videos, not any legitimate agency. It was the first real twist, proof that Deborah's enforcement officers had never been anything but theater from the start. I brought this information straight to Renata, who added it to our growing case file with visible satisfaction. "This isn't just harassment anymore," she said. "If they show up at your door in fake uniforms claiming authority to seize property, that's criminal impersonation and potentially attempted theft. And I intend to make sure everyone knows it." Duke, oblivious to the storm swirling around him, spent that week doing exactly what he always did, sunning himself on the porch, greeting the mailman with a wagging tail, resting his heavy head on my knee during the news each night. Watching him, I felt a fresh surge of protectiveness. I would not let them touch him. The 7-day surrender deadline arrived without me complying, backed now by Renata's second cease and desist letter explicitly stating that any attempt at physical seizure of my dog would be treated as theft and reported to local police immediately. Deborah didn't respond directly. Instead, the fines multiplied again, 6 more citations landing in a single week. I noticed something odd in the fine notices that week. Several referenced HOA reserve account numbers in a formatting error. Numbers that didn't match anything I'd seen in the association's public financial summaries from prior years. I mentioned it to Ellis, who suggested I request a full financial disclosure, something every homeowner was technically entitled to. My written request for financial records went unanswered for 11 days, well past the legal response window Georgia law required for HOA disclosure requests. Renata filed a formal demand citing the statute directly. Deborah's assistant treasurer, a soft-spoken man named Walter, finally responded with a vague promise that records would be available for review soon. Soon turned into another 3 weeks of silence, during which 2 more fabricated violations appeared. One for an unauthorized flag that was simply a small American flag I'd flown since moving in, honoring my service. Neighbors who saw the notice on the community app expressed open outrage for the first time. Public opinion was starting to shift. A local news blogger who covered neighborhood disputes reached out after seeing comments on the community app, asking if I'd be willing to share my story. I hesitated, wary of turning my private nightmare into public spectacle. But Renata encouraged transparency. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, she said. And Deborah has been operating entirely in the dark. I agreed to a brief, careful interview, sharing only documented facts. The accommodation letter, the fabricated committee, the fake enforcement badges Carla had uncovered. I said nothing speculative, nothing I couldn't prove. The blogger promised to verify everything independently before publishing anything, a professionalism I deeply appreciated given how much was already at stake. That same week, Duke developed a slight limp on his old shelter injury, and I took him to the vet out of caution. The vet, Dr. Alvarez, found nothing new, just old scar tissue acting up in the summer heat. Still, the fear of nearly losing him to a fabricated bureaucratic process made that routine visit feel unbearably tense.
Dr. Once I explained the situation, offered to write an updated behavioral and health assessment for Duke free of charge, noting his calm temperament during the exam and his complete lack of any aggression history. This dog, she said, scratching Duke's ears, wouldn't hurt a fly if you paid him to. I nearly cried with relief.
Armed with Dr. Tyler's mother's statement, my original accommodation letter, and Carla's photographic evidence of the fake badges, Renata compiled a formal complaint to the management company's corporate office, bypassing Deborah's local control entirely. She demanded an independent investigation into both the fabricated committee and the HOA's handling of homeowner disclosures. Corporate finally responded within days this time, an urgency that hadn't existed before Renata's involvement, promising to assign an outside compliance officer to review Cedar Hollow's recent enforcement actions. Deborah, notified of this development, requested an emergency board meeting the very next evening, one she scheduled with less than 24 hours notice to homeowners. I attended that emergency meeting anyway, Renata's advice ringing in my ears. Never skip an opportunity to be present and documented. Deborah opened by accusing me of spreading defamatory lies to outside media, and demanded the board formally censure me for conduct unbecoming a Cedar Hollow resident. The room fell into an uncomfortable, charged silence. To my surprise, one board member, a quiet accountant named Frank who rarely spoke at meetings, raised his hand and asked Deborah directly whether the enforcement committee had ever been approved by a proper board vote recorded in the meeting minutes. Deborah's confident expression flickered, just for a moment, before she claimed it had been verbally ratified. Frank pressed further, requesting the specific date of that verbal ratification so it could be cross-referenced against his own personal meeting notes, which he'd kept diligently for years as a habit from his accounting background. Deborah grew visibly flustered, insisting the matter was not up for interrogation, and attempting to move to the next agenda item. The censure motion against me failed for lack of a second, an outcome that would have been unthinkable months earlier when Deborah's word was effectively law. I left that meeting with a strange new feeling, not quite victory, but the first real sense that cracks were spreading through a wall I'd once believed was solid concrete. Frank approached me in the parking lot afterward, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. He'd noticed irregularities in the reserve fund reports for over a year, but had been too intimidated to raise them alone. "If you're building a case," he said quietly, "I might have documents that could help. But I need to think about this." I gave Frank my number and Renata's card, careful not to pressure him, understanding intimately how fear could paralyze even well-meaning people inside a system built on quiet intimidation. 3 days later, he called, voice tight with nerves, and agreed to meet Renata privately to share what he'd found buried in years of financial disclosures. What Frank shared stopped Renata mid-sentence during our next case review call. Reserve fund withdrawals over the past 4 years totaled nearly $90,000, more than any documented capital project could account for, all authorized by a single signature, Deborah Whitfield's. No cosigner, no itemized justification, just recurring transfers labeled vaguely as maintenance contingency. Renata explained that this alone wasn't proof of theft. HOA reserve funds could legitimately cover unexpected costs. But the complete absence of itemization combined with Deborah's sole signing authority created exactly the kind of pattern that regulators and prosecutors took seriously. It also explained, suddenly, why she'd fought so hard to avoid any financial disclosure request. I began to see the shape of something larger than a dog dispute or a petty power struggle. Deborah's aggressive enforcement, her fabricated committee, her resistance to transparency, they weren't separate problems. They were a single woman desperately protecting a house of cards from anyone who might accidentally knock against the wrong card and topple it. Duke's dangerous animal hearing, I realized, might never have been about Duke at all. It might have been a distraction, a way to keep me occupied with a personal crisis while discouraging me from asking the kinds of questions that Frank had quietly been asking for over a year. The thought made my anger burn colder and steadier. I shared this theory with Renata, who nodded slowly. "Bullies escalate control when they feel exposed," she said. The dog situation ramped up right around when Frank started digging. That's not necessarily a coincidence. She began building 2 parallel case files, one for the harassment against me, one for potential financial misconduct within the HOA itself. Meanwhile, Deborah seemed to sense the shifting ground beneath her, growing visibly more erratic at community events. She skipped the monthly newsletter for the first time in a decade, canceled a scheduled landscaping vote without explanation, and began parking her car crookedly across 2 spaces outside the clubhouse. Small signs of a woman losing her usual iron grip. The local blogger's story ran that week, carefully worded and fact-checked, detailing the fabricated committee, the questionable enforcement badges, and my documented accommodation letter for Duke. It avoided naming Deborah directly beyond her public role, but anyone in Cedar Hollow reading it knew exactly who it described. Comments flooded in from current and former residents alike. Several former residents I'd never met commented with their own stories. A family fined for a non-compliant mailbox that matched every other mailbox on the street. An elderly couple threatened with a lien over a wheelchair ramp installed for medical necessity. Pattern after pattern emerged publicly for the first time. Each comment another thread in the same fabric. Deborah's response to the article was swift and telling. She sent a mass email to all Cedar Hollow homeowners calling the piece malicious, one-sided propaganda, and threatened legal action against anonymous internet trolls spreading lies. She never once addressed the specific accommodation letter, the fake badges, or the reserve fund questions Frank had quietly begun asking. Notably, she also announced in that same email a temporary pause on Duke's surrender deadline, citing ongoing review, the first concession she'd made since this entire ordeal began. It felt less like mercy and more like a tactical retreat, a predator repositioning rather than abandoning the hunt. I didn't for a moment let my guard down. Renata agreed with my instinct completely. Women like this don't stop, she told me over the phone. They regroup. Harder. Probably through a channel that feels less accountable than public meetings. She was right, though neither of us could have predicted exactly how far Deborah would eventually go. I began installing a doorbell camera and 2 additional exterior cameras covering my front yard and driveway, partly for Duke's protection, partly on Renata's explicit recommendation. If anyone shows up claiming authority they don't have, she said, you want irrefutable footage, not just your word against theirs. I ordered the equipment the same afternoon and installed it myself. Frank continued quietly gathering documentation, forwarding Renata copies of reserve fund statements going back 6 years, cross-referencing withdrawal dates against actual completed maintenance projects listed in old newsletters. The gaps grew more glaring with each passing document. Transfers with no corresponding invoices. Contractor names that didn't match any licensed business operating in the county. One name recurred suspiciously often in those contractor listings: Whitfield Property Solutions, an entity Frank couldn't find registered anywhere with the Georgia Secretary of State. Renata's eyes lit up when she saw it. That's either a shell company, she said, or an outright fabrication. Either way, we need to find out exactly what it is. A quick corporate records search confirmed it. No business by that name had ever been registered in Georgia. Someone had been writing HOA reserve fund checks to a company that legally didn't exist. Checks ultimately deposited. Frank discovered through careful cross-referencing of bank routing details into an account linked to Deborah's late husband's old contracting business. I sat with that discovery for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what we'd uncovered settle into place. This wasn't just a difficult HOA president enforcing overzealous rules. This was potentially years of quiet financial fraud, hidden behind a reputation for strictness that had discouraged anyone from ever looking closely enough to notice. For a brief stretch that August, things went strangely calm. No new fines arrived. Deborah stopped attending the community pool in the evenings where our paths usually crossed. Duke and I resumed our normal walks, and for the first time in months, I let myself enjoy an uneventful Sunday afternoon without checking the mailbox with dread. Renata warned me not to mistake this calm for resolution. She was quietly building our case, coordinating with a forensic accountant colleague to formally analyze the reserve fund discrepancies Frank had uncovered, while also preparing documentation for a potential complaint to the Georgia Real Estate Commission regarding the fabricated enforcement committee and impersonation concerns. I used the lull to reconnect with parts of my life I'd neglected during the stress. Resuming physical therapy sessions with a veteran support group I'd missed for weeks. Taking Duke on longer hikes at a nearby state park where he could run leash-free through open fields. His old limp barely noticeable when he was truly happy. Ellis and I grew closer during this quiet period, sharing dinners on his porch while he told stories about Cedar Hollows earlier, gentler years before Deborah's ascension to the board. He'd watched 3 prior HOA presidents come and go, none remotely like her. She didn't seize power, he said once. We handed it to her because we were tired. Carla stayed in touch too, occasionally forwarding new tips from former Cedar Hollow residents still scattered across the county, each one adding small corroborating details to the larger pattern. One woman mentioned Deborah had once threatened to report her immigration status to authorities during a fence dispute, despite the woman being a natural-born citizen. The cruelty ran deep. Frank's forensic accountant colleague completed a preliminary review during this quiet stretch, confirming what we'd already suspected. The Whitfield Property Solutions payments showed clear indicators of fund diversion. Checks issued for landscaping and maintenance work that satellite imagery and dated photographs proved had simply never been performed. The reserve fund was missing real money, not paperwork errors. Renata scheduled a meeting with an assistant district attorney she knew personally, presenting our compiled evidence informally before filing anything official, hoping to gauge whether the case merited criminal investigation rather than just civil action. The ADA reviewed the documents for nearly an hour before looking up. "This isn't hypothetical," she said. "This is a real case." I felt a strange mixture of vindication and unease hearing that. Part of me still remembered Deborah smiling and thanking me publicly for repainting the community sign. Still struggled to reconcile that ordinary neighbor with a woman potentially guilty of years of calculated fraud. Renata reminded me gently that the 2 images weren't contradictory. Cruelty rarely announced itself honestly. The ADA requested additional documentation before formally opening an investigation, specifically bank records directly from the HOA's financial institution rather than internal reports Deborah could have altered. Frank, terrified but resolute, agreed to formally request those records in his capacity as assistant treasurer, a legal right he held regardless of Deborah's objections or intimidation. Deborah, perhaps sensing renewed scrutiny despite the outward calm, suddenly announced a community appreciation event for the following weekend, complete with a catered barbecue and a raffle, an uncharacteristically generous gesture from a woman who'd never hosted anything beyond mandatory annual meetings. Neighbors speculated it was an image repair effort after the blogger's article. I attended the event cautiously, Duke on his leash beside me, curious what Deborah's next move might reveal about her mental state under mounting pressure. She greeted me with performative warmth in front of other homeowners, even kneeling briefly to pat Duke's head for a photo someone snapped, a jarring contrast to her private hostility toward us both. Later that evening, away from the cameras, she cornered me near the drink table, her friendly mask slipping entirely. "You think you're clever," she hissed, voice low enough that only I could hear. "Digging through records that aren't yours to see. This is my community. I will not let you take it from me." I didn't respond with anger, remembering Renata's advice to never give Deborah an emotionally charged reaction she could later mischaracterize to others. I simply said, I just want to keep my dog and live in my house without harassment. And walked away. Duke's leash steady in my hand. My heart pounding harder than my calm expression let on. That confrontation, brief as it was, confirmed something important. Deborah knew exactly what we were investigating, likely tipped off by Walter or another board member with access to Frank's financial requests. The calm period was ending. I called Renata that same night to warn her, and she immediately began preparing contingency plans for what might come next. When someone like this feels cornered, Renata told me, they don't quietly surrender. They lash out, often irrationally, sometimes in ways that finally cross a line clear enough for everyone to see. Neither of us could have predicted just how literally that warning would come true within the following weeks, or how far Deborah was willing to go. The pause on Duke's surrender deadline abruptly ended 9 days after the barbecue. A new notice arriving by certified mail declaring the review period concluded, and demanding immediate compliance within 48 hours or the HOA would exercise all necessary enforcement authority to remove Duke from my property. The wording felt deliberately, chillingly vague. Renata fired back instantly with a letter reiterating that any physical attempt to remove Duke would constitute theft and trespassing, copying both the local police department and the Georgia Real Estate Commission for the record. She also formally notified Deborah, in writing, that a financial misconduct investigation involving HOA reserve funds was actively underway. That last part, Renata admitted afterward, was calculated, revealing the financial investigation now, rather than keeping it secret longer, was meant to force Deborah into a defensive posture where any aggressive move against Duke would look exactly like what it was, retaliation against a whistleblower rather than legitimate community safety enforcement. Deborah's reply came not through official channels, but through a flyer distributed to every mailbox on Magnolia Court, accusing certain homeowners of orchestrating a smear campaign against her leadership and calling for a vote of confidence at the next board meeting. She named no one directly, but the implication toward me was impossible to miss. The community's reaction surprised me. Rather than rallying behind Deborah as she'd clearly hoped, several longtime residents began openly questioning her leadership for the first time in years. Emboldened by the blogger's article and rumors of financial irregularities now spreading informally through group chats and porch conversations across the neighborhood, Ellis told me the vote of confidence flyer had backfired spectacularly among his circle of longtime friends in Cedar Hollow. People don't like being told what to think, he said. The more she pushes, the more they push back. For the first time, I sensed genuine cracks forming not just in Deborah's authority, but in her control. 2 days before the 48-hour deadline, I received an unexpected call from Walter, the assistant treasurer, his voice trembling. He wanted to talk, off the record, about something troubling he'd witnessed. We met at a diner outside the neighborhood where he'd feel safer speaking freely, away from any chance of Deborah's associates overhearing us. Walter revealed that Deborah had recently hired 2 men through an unlicensed private contractor, not affiliated with any legitimate security company, specifically to handle the dog situation if I didn't comply voluntarily. He'd overheard her on a call describing them as no-nonsense guys who know how to get things done quietly. My stomach dropped hearing this. I asked Walter if he knew the men's names. He didn't, but he recalled Deborah mentioning one had security experience, though he sounded uncertain what kind. He'd grown increasingly uneasy working alongside her over recent months, especially after realizing his own signature had been used, without his full understanding, to approve some of those questionable reserve fund transfers. Renata immediately relayed this new information to both the ADA and the local police non-emergency line, formally documenting a credible threat of unauthorized entry and potential theft targeting my property. An officer named Detective Ramirez took the report seriously, noting the pattern of escalation and advising me to keep my new camera system fully operational. Detective Ramirez explained that while HOA disputes rarely warranted police involvement, threats of unauthorized property seizure by individuals falsely claiming enforcement authority crossed clearly into criminal territory. He promised increased patrol presence on Magnolia Court over the coming days and asked me to call immediately if anyone unfamiliar approached my property claiming HOA authority. I spent that evening reviewing my camera footage settings with Renata on speakerphone, ensuring everything recorded automatically to cloud storage that couldn't be tampered with locally. Duke seemed to sense my tension, staying unusually close, his heavy head resting against my leg while I worked, as if he understood something significant was building toward us both. The 48-hour deadline passed without anyone appearing at my door, though the anxious waiting felt almost worse than an actual confrontation might have. I barely slept that night, checking the camera feed every few hours. Duke curled protectively at the foot of my bed instead of his usual spot by the window. 3 more days passed in tense stillness before Deborah's next move revealed itself. Not through official HOA channels this time, but through a private investigator she'd apparently hired to surveil my daily routine, searching, Renata suspected, for any excuse she could exploit, a missed leash law, an unregistered vehicle, anything to justify aggressive action. I noticed an unfamiliar sedan parked down the street for several consecutive mornings, always positioned with a clear view of my driveway. Ellis noticed it too and, being naturally suspicious of strangers after decades in the neighborhood, jotted down the license plate discreetly, passing it along to me the following afternoon over the fence. Renata ran the plate through a colleague with appropriate access and confirmed it belonged to a small, recently formed investigations firm with no significant track record, operating out of a shared office space 2 counties over. It wasn't illegal to hire investigators, she explained, but the timing and target made the intent unmistakably clear. The surveillance continued for nearly 2 weeks, during which Deborah oddly made no further direct moves against Duke or me, seemingly waiting for something specific, some vulnerability or misstep she could exploit. I grew hyper-aware of every small routine, double-checking Duke's leash length, his registration tags, anything that might otherwise provide fresh ammunition against us. Frank, meanwhile, continued quietly assisting the forensic investigation, though he confided in Renata that Deborah had grown noticeably suspicious of him too, excluding him from certain board conversations and once accusing him directly, without evidence, of leaking confidential association business to outside parties. He worried his own position on the board was becoming untenable. I felt a growing guilt about the risk Frank had taken on my behalf. A man with no personal stake in Duke's fate who'd simply refused to look away from clear wrongdoing once he'd noticed it. Renata reassured me that Frank's actions were protected under Georgia's Homeowner Association transparency laws, though legal protection rarely erased personal anxiety. The stillness broke on a humid Thursday evening in early September. I returned home from a late shift at the VA clinic to find a manila envelope taped to my front door. No postage. Hand-delivered. Inside was a single typed page. A final notice demanding Duke's surrender within 24 hours, by whatever means necessary. The phrase, by whatever means necessary, sent an immediate chill through me. Language far more aggressive than any prior HOA correspondence. Language that sounded less like a bureaucratic warning and more like a personal threat. I photographed the letter, called Renata immediately, and forwarded everything to Detective Ramirez within the hour. My hands unsteady. Renata called the letter itself potentially actionable, noting that by whatever means necessary, combined with the earlier reports of hired unlicensed enforcers, suggested a genuine risk of unauthorized entry or confrontation. She advised me to avoid leaving Duke unattended in the yard even briefly, and to keep my phone recording ready at all times. Detective Ramirez arranged for a patrol car to drive past Magnolia Court more frequently that night and the following day, though he was honest about the limits of what proactive policing could realistically prevent without an actual incident occurring first. Document everything, he said. If they show up, that's when we can act decisively. I barely functioned at work the next day. Distracted, checking my phone constantly for camera alerts, counting down hours until the 24-hour deadline passed. My supervisor at the clinic, noticing my distraction, let me leave early once I briefly explained the situation, offering quiet, genuine sympathy that momentarily steadied my rattled nerves. I arrived home to find everything undisturbed, Duke waiting eagerly at the door as always, and allowed myself a small, cautious exhale of relief. The deadline had technically passed without incident. I told myself, perhaps naively, that the sheer volume of documentation and legal pressure had finally forced Deborah to reconsider her most extreme threats. That relief lasted only until the following morning, when I discovered my backyard gate standing slightly ajar. Though nothing appeared disturbed and Duke remained safely inside the fenced yard, alert but calm. I couldn't be certain if I'd simply forgotten to latch it properly, or if someone had tested the perimeter overnight, testing for weaknesses. I reviewed the camera footage immediately and found a brief, grainy clip from around 2 in the morning. A figure in dark clothing pausing near the gate for several seconds before walking away. Face obscured by shadow and a low cap. It wasn't conclusive enough for police action, Detective Ramirez admitted, but it confirmed my worst instinct. Renata escalated immediately, filing an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order against Deborah personally, citing the pattern of harassment, the threatening letter, the hired unlicensed enforcers, and now the suspicious nighttime activity near my property. A judge agreed to review the petition on an expedited basis given the documented escalation pattern. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week, giving us a concrete legal deadline to work toward. Renata warned me that temporary restraining orders weren't automatic even with strong evidence, and that Deborah, given her apparent resources and connections, might mount a more organized defense than her chaotic behavior so far suggested. I spent the days before the hearing compiling everything into a single organized binder at Renata's request. The accommodation letter, Tyler's mother's statement, Dr. Alvarez's health assessment, the fake enforcement badges Carla had photographed, Frank's financial documentation, Walter's account of the hired enforcers, and now the threatening letter and gate footage. A complete timeline. Ellis offered to attend the hearing as a character witness regarding Deborah's long history of aggressive enforcement against other neighbors, and Carla agreed to testify remotely about her own family's experience 2 years earlier, including the identical fake enforcement badges. Their willingness to stand publicly against her moved me more than I expected it to. The night before the hearing, I sat on my porch with Duke, watching the sun set over Magnolia Court, thinking about how a quiet neighborhood I'd chosen for peace had become the site of the strangest battle of my life outside actual combat. Duke leaned his heavy head against my shoulder, seemingly aware something important loomed ahead. The restraining order hearing took place in a modest county courtroom, far less theatrical than Deborah's clubhouse tribunal, but infinitely more consequential. Renata presented our timeline methodically, evidence flowing chronologically from the fabricated committee through the threatening letter, while Deborah's attorney, hastily retained, seemed visibly unprepared for the sheer volume of documentation. Deborah testified in her own defense, insisting all actions had been legitimate HOA enforcement conducted in the community's best interest, and characterizing my legal response as disproportionate retaliation against reasonable rule enforcement. Her composure was impressive. I had to admit, a performance polished by over a decade of controlling every room she entered. Under cross-examination, however, Renata methodically dismantled that composure, asking pointed questions about the fabricated compliance and safety committee, the unregistered Whitfield Property Solutions checks, and the unlicensed men hired to handle the dog situation. Deborah's answers grew increasingly evasive, her carefully constructed narrative fraying visibly under sustained, specific pressure. The judge granted a temporary restraining order, finding sufficient evidence of a credible pattern of harassment and potential threat, barring Deborah from any direct contact with me or attempts to remove Duke pending a full hearing scheduled for several weeks later. It wasn't a final victory, but it felt, finally, like real protection. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself in months: cautious hope. Renata warned me the fight was far from over, that restraining orders addressed immediate safety, but didn't resolve the underlying HOA dispute or the potential financial fraud investigation, both of which would require considerably more time to fully unfold. Deborah's public response to the restraining order was, predictably, defiant. She sent another community-wide email framing herself as a victim of faceless legal intimidation, and vowing to continue protecting Cedar Hollow's standards regardless of what she called temporary legal setbacks. Several homeowners, I noticed, stopped responding to her emails entirely after that message. The financial investigation, meanwhile, gained new momentum. The ADA's office formally opened a case following Frank's documentation and the forensic accountant's preliminary findings, subpoenaing full bank records for both the HOA reserve account and, notably, the dormant contracting business linked to Deborah's late husband that had received the questionable payments. Frank told me privately that he felt an enormous weight lifting once the investigation became official, no longer solely his responsibility to carry evidence quietly. He resigned from his board position shortly after, citing irreconcilable differences regarding association governance, a diplomatic phrase that everyone in Cedar Hollow correctly understood as a pointed, deliberate statement. Walter, too, cooperated fully with investigators once the case became official, providing detailed testimony about the transfers he'd unknowingly co-signed and the pressure he'd felt to avoid questioning Deborah's financial decisions. His cooperation, prosecutors later noted, proved crucial in establishing a clear timeline of intent rather than mere accounting carelessness. Despite the restraining order and mounting investigation, Deborah showed no signs of genuine retreat, only increasingly reckless improvisation. Neighbors reported seeing her car parked near the community entrance at odd hours, watching foot traffic, and she began appearing uninvited at informal gatherings, inserting herself into conversations with a brittle, unsettling intensity that worried longtime residents. I maintained strict compliance with the restraining order myself, avoiding any direct contact, routing all communication exclusively through Renata, determined to give Deborah's increasingly erratic behavior no ammunition whatsoever to claim I'd provoked or violated the court's protective terms. Every walk with Duke now felt like a carefully documented exercise in caution. One evening, Detective Ramirez called with an update. The private investigation firm Deborah had hired to surveil me had abruptly severed ties with her, citing, according to a source he'd developed, concerns about the legality and scope of requested activities. Even hired professionals seemed recognized when a client's demands crossed clear legal lines. That development suggested Deborah's resources and cooperation network were thinning rapidly under legal and financial pressure. Renata theorized that mounting attorney fees, combined with the frozen HOA reserve account pending investigation, were straining Deborah's finances significantly beyond what her outward composure at community events still managed to project convincingly to onlookers. Ellis mentioned overhearing, secondhand through another longtime resident, that Deborah's house had a second mortgage taken out just 8 months earlier, an unusual financial move for someone widely assumed to be comfortably wealthy. Piece by piece, a picture emerged of a woman whose controlling public image concealed a private life quietly collapsing under strain. I tried not to feel satisfaction in her unraveling, mindful of Renata's advice to stay focused on protecting Duke and myself rather than dwelling on Deborah's downfall as some kind of personal victory lap. Still, quiet, undeniable relief settled over me each time another piece of her carefully maintained facade cracked further under scrutiny. The full restraining order hearing, delayed twice due to Deborah's attorney requesting continuances, finally approached in late September, coinciding almost exactly with the criminal investigation's expected timeline for potential charges. Renata warned me both processes moving in parallel could create legal complications, but also significant pressure that might force a faster resolution overall. Duke's formal, dangerous animal designation, technically still on record despite the restraining order halting active enforcement, remained an unresolved administrative loose thread that troubled me. Renata assured me it would be formally challenged and vacated once the fabricated committee's illegitimacy was fully established in the broader case. But the lingering uncertainty still gnawed at me. I began attending veteran support group sessions more consistently again during this stretch, finding the structured space to process ongoing stress invaluable amid everything unfolding around Duke and me. My counselor there, a fellow former medic named Josh, reminded me gently that surviving prolonged conflict required pacing myself, not just enduring every single battle simultaneously. Duke, remarkably resilient throughout months of chaos he couldn't possibly understand, remained my steadiest anchor, greeting each day with the same simple joy regardless of what legal filings or camera alerts had consumed my previous night. Watching him chase a tennis ball across the backyard reminded me exactly why I'd fought so hard to protect him. As September wore on, whispers around Cedar Hollow shifted decisively. Where once homeowners avoided discussing Deborah out of fear, Now informal gatherings buzzed openly with speculation about the investigation, the restraining order, and rumors of financial irregularities. The silence that had protected her for over a decade had finally, completely broken apart. Deborah's desperation crystallized into something far more dangerous in early October. Detective Ramirez called late one night, voice unusually urgent, warning that his department had received a tip about Deborah recruiting two men, potentially the same unlicensed contractors Walter had described earlier, for what the tipster described only as taking care of the dog problem permanently. The phrase permanently chilled me in ways the earlier, by whatever means necessary, letter hadn't quite managed. Detective Ramirez couldn't specify exactly what it meant, whether it referenced physical seizure, harm to Duke, or something else entirely, but he recommended immediately boarding Duke somewhere secure and unpredictable until the situation could be properly assessed. I arranged emergency boarding for Duke that same night at Dr. Alvarez's clinic, which offered secure overnight facilities, choosing it specifically because it wasn't publicly associated with my address and offered round-the-clock staff presence. Driving him there in the dark, I felt a fear more acute than anything I'd experienced since my last deployment. Duke seemed to sense my distress during that drive, resting his head against my arm at every red light, and I found myself talking to him the entire way, explaining things he couldn't understand but seemed to absorb anyway through simple, steady presence. Leaving him at the clinic that night was one of the hardest moments of the entire ordeal. Renata filed an emergency motion the next morning requesting the restraining order be expanded to explicitly prohibit any third parties acting on Deborah's behalf from approaching
my property or attempting to access Duke, closing a potential loophole where hired individuals might claim they personally weren't bound by the original order's specific language.
The judge granted the expanded order within 48 hours, explicitly naming any agents, contractors, or associates acting under Deborah's direction as equally bound by the restraining order's terms. It felt like another important legal victory, but Detective Ramirez cautioned that paper protections meant little against someone seemingly willing to ignore legal boundaries entirely. I increased my camera coverage further, adding motion-activated lighting around the entire perimeter of my property and installing a secondary battery backup system in case anyone attempted to cut power to disable the cameras themselves. Ellis, watching me work one afternoon, quietly offered to keep a spare key and check the property whenever I was away. The unlicensed contractors Deborah had allegedly hired remained frustratingly unidentified for several tense days. Detective Ramirez's department working leads without a confirmed breakthrough. I kept Duke boarded at Dr. Alvarez's clinic throughout this period, visiting him daily. Our walks around the clinic's small exercise yard a poor substitute for our usual neighborhood routes. A breakthrough finally came through Walter, who, digging through old text messages at Renata's careful request, found a name he'd overheard but hadn't previously connected. Ray Doggett, a man Deborah had apparently used before for problem situations around Cedar Hollow. Someone Walter vaguely recalled being mentioned in connection with an earlier dispute involving a different homeowner's fence. Detective Ramirez ran the name and found Ray Doggett had a criminal record including a prior conviction for impersonating a security officer in a neighboring county. Exactly the kind of pattern that matched the fake HOA enforcement badges Carla had photographed years earlier. The pieces of Deborah's shadow operation were finally assembling into a coherent, damning shape. This discovery gave the investigation significant new weight. If Deborah had knowingly hired someone with a prior impersonation conviction to intimidate homeowners under fake enforcement authority, it strengthened not only my restraining order case but potentially opened additional criminal exposure for her directly, beyond the financial fraud allegations already building steadily against her. Renata relayed this development with visible cautious optimism during our next call, though she reminded me that building airtight criminal cases took time. Evidence had to be gathered meticulously, and Deborah, increasingly cornered, might grow more unpredictable rather than more compliant as the walls closed in around her carefully constructed facade. That unpredictability manifested just days later. Deborah appeared uninvited at the Veteran Support Group's community outreach table during a local farmers market event I'd volunteered to help staff, approaching directly despite the restraining order's clear terms, loudly announcing to nearby bystanders that I was harassing an elderly widow with false accusations. I immediately stepped back, refusing any direct engagement, and quietly asked a nearby event organizer to call the police while recording the entire interaction on my phone, careful to stay outwardly calm despite my racing heart. Deborah's voice grew louder, more theatrical, clearly performing outrage for the small, uncomfortable crowd gathering around us. A responding officer arrived within minutes, and upon reviewing my phone footage alongside the active restraining order documentation Renata had ensured I always carried digitally, arrested Deborah on the spot for violating the court's explicit terms. Watching her be handcuffed in a public parking lot felt surreal, an image I never imagined witnessing. The arrest, captured partially on several bystanders' phones, spread quickly through Cedar Hollow's community app and local social media groups. What had once been carefully managed rumors and private grievances became undeniable public fact. Deborah Whitfield, longtime HOA president, had been arrested for violating a restraining order tied to harassment allegations against a veteran. Deborah was released later that day on minor charges, but the arrest itself proved a significant turning point in public perception. Neighbors who'd remained cautiously neutral throughout the ordeal now spoke openly, some even reaching out directly to apologize for not believing me sooner, admitting they'd simply been too afraid to challenge her openly before. Renata used the arrest strategically, filing it as additional evidence supporting the pending full restraining order hearing and forwarding documentation to the ADA's office as further proof of Deborah's escalating, uncontrolled behavior under legal and financial pressure. "This is exactly the pattern that makes prosecutors move faster," she told me with quiet satisfaction. I retrieved Duke from Dr. Alvarez's clinic that evening, cautiously optimistic that Deborah's public arrest and mounting legal troubles might finally deter further direct action. Though Detective Ramirez still urged continued vigilance regarding Ray Doggett and any other associates Deborah might still attempt to deploy despite her own increasingly precarious legal position. Duke's reunion with home was joyful chaos, tail wagging so hard his entire body shook, running immediate laps around the backyard as though reclaiming territory he somehow understood had been threatened. I sat on the porch steps watching him, allowing myself, finally, a genuine unguarded smile after what felt like months of relentless tension. That relief, however, proved short-lived. 3 days after her release, Deborah was spotted by Ellis loading unfamiliar equipment into her garage late at night. Boxes he described as looking like cages or crates, the big kind. Concerned, he photographed what he could from a safe distance and immediately sent the images to me and Renata. Renata forwarded the photographs to Detective Ramirez, who agreed the equipment's appearance, combined with everything already known about Deborah's escalating desperation and Ray Doggett's involvement, warranted increased surveillance of her property. He couldn't obtain a search warrant based on photographs alone, but he assigned additional patrol attention to Magnolia Court that week. I barely slept over the following days, Duke's leash never leaving my hand even inside my own house. Cameras checked obsessively at every notification. Josh, my support group counselor, reminded me during a difficult session that hypervigilance, while understandable given real threats, still needed conscious management to avoid completely consuming my daily functioning. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally arrived on a Saturday morning in mid-October, exactly 4 months after Deborah's first suspicious visit to my door. I was in my backyard with Duke when I heard an unfamiliar vehicle pull into my driveway, followed by determined footsteps approaching my side gate rather than the front door. 2 men I didn't recognize, one heavy-set and silent, the other leaner with a clipboard and a laminated badge clipped ostentatiously to his shirt pocket, peered at my gate, announcing themselves as certified animal control enforcement, there to execute an official surrender order for Duke. My cameras, thankfully, were already recording everything automatically. I kept Duke firmly beside me on his leash, stepping calmly toward the gate but not opening it, my phone already recording a second angle in my free hand. I'd like to see actual government identification, I said steadily, and the name of the specific agency you claim to represent. Please provide it clearly. The leaner man, later identified as Ray Doggett himself, faltered visibly at the direct request, glancing toward his silent companion before claiming his identification was in the vehicle. I informed them clearly that Cedar Hollow was subject to an active court restraining order preventing anyone acting on Deborah Whitfield's behalf from approaching my property or attempting to remove Duke. Doggett's demeanor shifted immediately from confident authority to visible uncertainty, and his companion took a noticeable step backward toward their vehicle. I informed them I was recording everything and had already contacted police, which was true, having triggered a silent alarm feature on my phone connected directly to the local non-emergency dispatch line moments earlier. A patrol car, part of the increased attention Detective Ramirez had arranged for Magnolia Court that week, arrived within astonishingly quick minutes, likely already positioned nearby given the ongoing surveillance concerns. The responding officers separated the 2 men immediately, requesting identification and explanation for their presence at my property despite the active restraining order. Neither man could produce any legitimate government-issued animal control credentials. Only the same laminated novelty badges Carla had photographed years earlier at her own confrontation. Ray Doggett's prior impersonation conviction, already flagged in the department system from Detective Ramirez's earlier research, immediately elevated the encounter from a simple trespassing complaint into serious criminal territory. Doggett was arrested on the spot for criminal impersonation of a public officer and violation of the restraining order's expanded terms covering third parties acting on Deborah's behalf. His silent companion, identified as a man named Curtis with no prior record, cooperated fully, immediately implicating Deborah as having personally directed and paid them for the operation. Curtis's cooperation proved enormously valuable. He revealed that Deborah had paid them in cash specifically to avoid any traceable transaction, explicitly instructing them to just take the dog if he won't hand it over willingly. Don't argue. Don't wait around. Hearing those words repeated by an officer afterward left me physically shaking with delayed adrenaline. Detective Ramirez informed me directly that Curtis's statement, combined with the physical evidence at my gate and my own camera footage, provided more than sufficient probable cause to seek an arrest warrant for Deborah Whitfield herself on charges including criminal impersonation conspiracy, attempted theft, and violation of a protective order, charges that would likely stick decisively. I sat on my porch steps that afternoon, Duke pressed protectively against my side, watching patrol cars finally leave Magnolia Court after what had nearly become the exact seizure I'd feared for 4 agonizing months. The reality of how close it had come, and how thoroughly it had ultimately failed, left me emotionally raw and exhausted. News of the failed seizure attempt and Doggett's arrest spread through Cedar Hollow faster than anything before it. No longer whispered rumors but confirmed public record involving actual criminal charges. Even homeowners who'd remained studiously neutral throughout the entire saga could no longer avoid acknowledging what had genuinely been happening in their own community. Deborah's arrest warrant was issued within 2 days, and Detective Ramirez personally informed me once it had been executed, describing her reaction as shock, mostly like she genuinely believed nothing would ever actually catch up with her. I felt no particular satisfaction hearing that, only a tired, complicated relief that the immediate danger had finally passed. The criminal charges against Deborah expanded rapidly once investigators combined the failed seizure attempt with the ongoing financial fraud investigation into the reserve fund and the fabricated Whitfield Property Solutions payments. Prosecutors now had a comprehensive case spanning conspiracy, impersonation, attempted theft, and financial fraud, all interconnected pieces of one woman's sustained abuse of power. Renata explained that Deborah's bail conditions included surrendering her passport and avoiding any contact with me, Frank, Walter, Ellis, or Carla, effectively barring her from the community leadership role she'd held for over a decade. The HOA board, in an emergency session, voted unanimously to suspend her presidency pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Frank, despite having resigned earlier, agreed to temporarily rejoin the board in an advisory capacity to help stabilize Cedar Hollow's governance during the transition, working alongside newly appointed interim leadership to begin the difficult process of untangling years of Deborah's unilateral, unchecked financial and administrative decisions across the entire association. I visited Dr. Moore, not out of necessity this time, but simply to thank her for the assessment that had helped protect Duke throughout this entire ordeal. She hugged me warmly, admitting she'd followed the local news coverage closely and had never doubted, from that very first exam, that Duke posed no danger whatsoever. Ellis and I shared a quiet dinner on his porch that week, both of us processing the strange, exhausting journey that had brought an entire neighborhood's hidden dysfunction into sudden, undeniable daylight. Took a veteran and his dog to finally do what the rest of us should have done years ago, he said softly, raising his glass. Carla called that same week too, her voice lighter than I'd ever heard it, finally feeling some measure of vindication for what her own family had endured 2 years earlier without anyone believing them at the time. You did what none of us managed to, she said. I reminded her firmly that it had been all of us together. The forensic accounting investigation, now fully empowered by subpoenaed bank records, ultimately traced over $115,000 in fraudulent reserve fund transfers across 4 years, money diverted through the fake contracting company directly into accounts controlling Deborah's mortgage payments and personal expenses following her husband's death and mounting medical debts. Learning the actual dollar figure involved left even Renata visibly stunned during our final case review meeting before trial preparations began in earnest. "This wasn't just cruelty for its own sake," she said grimly. "She was desperate. And desperate people protecting something they've stolen become genuinely dangerous to anyone who threatens to expose them." As autumn deepened, Cedar Hollow entered a strange transitional period. An interim board struggling to restore basic trust and functional governance, while criminal proceedings against Deborah slowly advanced through the court system. Regular community meetings, once tightly controlled theatrical performances, became genuinely open forums for the first time in over a decade. I attended one such meeting reluctantly, still wary of public scrutiny after months of being the community's central controversy, but found instead genuine warmth and gratitude from neighbors who finally understood the full scope of what Deborah's leadership had actually involved behind its polished, controlling exterior. Several people thanked me directly, some tearfully. Renata began preparing intensively for the upcoming criminal trial, coordinating closely with the ADA's office to ensure every piece of evidence, my camera footage, Frank's financial documentation, Curtis's cooperation statement, Carla's photographs, would present as a cohesive, overwhelming case rather than scattered incidents that a skilled defense attorney might attempt to isolate individually. Deborah's defense attorney, meanwhile, requested and received a psychological evaluation as part of standard pretrial proceedings, a request Renata characterized privately as a likely attempt to build mitigating circumstances around Deborah's obvious financial desperation and grief following her husband's death, rather than any genuine claim of diminished capacity or confusion. I found myself, unexpectedly, feeling flickers of something almost like pity amid my continued anger, imagining the isolation and desperation that might drive someone to build such an elaborate, cruel campaign of control rather than simply asking her community for help during a genuine financial crisis. Josh reminded me that empathy and accountability weren't mutually exclusive. Duke, blissfully unaware of trial preparations and legal strategy, simply continued being Duke, greeting each Cedar Hollow neighbor who now regularly stopped to pet him during our walks with the same unguarded enthusiasm he'd always shown, seemingly incapable of holding a grudge against a world that had briefly, nearly, taken everything from him. Walter's continued cooperation proved instrumental as trial preparation intensified, providing detailed testimony not just about the specific fraudulent transfers but about the broader culture of intimidation Deborah had cultivated within the board itself, discouraging questions, punishing dissent, and consolidating financial control entirely within her own unchecked signing authority for over a decade. Frank similarly prepared for his role as a key witness, having overcome his initial fear to become one of the investigation's most crucial contributors. "I kept thinking someone else would do something," he admitted to me once. "Eventually I realized that someone else was supposed to be me, and probably had been for a long time already." The interim HOA board, guided partly by Frank's advisory input, began implementing structural reforms designed to prevent any future president from wielding the kind of unchecked authority Deborah had exploited for years. Mandatory dual signatures on all financial transfers, annual independent audits, and term limits restricting any single leadership tenure to a maximum of 4 years total. I attended a reform planning session at Renata's suggestion, offering input specifically regarding the fabricated committee structure that had nearly cost me my dog, advocating for clear bylaw language, explicitly prohibiting any HOA board from claiming law enforcement authority or forming committees without full, documented, recorded board approval and homeowner notification requirements moving forward. The proposed reforms passed unanimously at the next general meeting, the highest homeowner attendance Cedar Hollow had seen in years, filling the clubhouse well beyond its usual sparse turnout. Watching neighbors actively engage in shaping their community's governance, rather than passively accepting whatever Deborah had previously dictated, felt like witnessing something genuinely healing unfold. Deborah's trial date was finally set for early December, giving both prosecution and defense several remaining weeks to finalize preparations. Renata warned me the process would likely be emotionally difficult, requiring me to testify in detail about months of sustained harassment, the threatening letters, and the terrifying morning Ray Doggett had appeared at my gate. I began working with Josh specifically on preparing for the emotional weight of testifying, practicing grounding techniques we'd developed together during my earlier deployment's aftermath, recognizing that courtroom testimony, while different from combat, still required similar mental discipline to remain composed while recounting genuinely traumatic experiences in precise, factual detail for the record. Duke's official, dangerous animal designation was formally vacated during this period, following a hearing where the fabricated compliance and safety committee's complete illegitimacy was finally, officially established in the county record, alongside Dr. Alvarez's original behavioral assessment and Tyler's mother's consistent statement that Duke had never posed any threat whatsoever. I framed the official vacation order alongside Duke's original accommodation letter, hanging both in my home office as a quiet reminder of everything we'd survived together. Evidence not just for any future dispute but for myself. On difficult days, that persistence and documentation had ultimately triumphed over intimidation and fabricated authority. The financial fraud charges against Deborah expanded once more as investigators traced additional smaller transfers previously overlooked, revealing a pattern stretching back even further than initially believed. Nearly 7 years total, suggesting the fraudulent scheme had begun almost immediately after her husband's death rather than developing gradually under mounting financial pressure. This revelation shifted public and legal characterization of Deborah's actions somewhat. From a woman who'd desperately spiraled into fraud during genuine crisis toward someone who'd calculated and sustained a long-term theft scheme methodically, using her HOA authority deliberately as both cover and enforcement mechanism against anyone who might eventually threaten to expose it. Renata noted this distinction mattered significantly for sentencing considerations. Should Deborah ultimately be convicted, differentiating between a single moment of poor judgment and a sustained, calculated pattern of exploitation. 7 years, she said quietly during one preparation session, means she built an entire system specifically designed to protect years of theft. I processed this information slowly, feeling my earlier flickers of pity harden back into clear-eyed resolve. Whatever grief or financial desperation had initially motivated her, Deborah had ultimately chosen, repeatedly and deliberately over years, to protect stolen money by weaponizing her community authority against innocent neighbors. Myself and Duke simply the latest targets in a long pattern. Cedar Hollow's interim board scheduled a special informational session in late November specifically addressing the reserve fund shortfall, explaining to homeowners the financial reality of over $115,000 missing and outlining a recovery plan involving both a civil lawsuit against Deborah personally and modest special assessments to rebuild depleted reserves. Attending that session, I watched neighbors process genuine financial impact from Deborah's actions for the first time, moving beyond abstract outrage about harassment into concrete understanding of dollars. Projects deferred, maintenance neglected, all while she'd controlled a narrative of strict, responsible fiscal stewardship that had, in reality, concealed years of quiet theft. Carla joined a growing group chat of current and former Cedar Hollow residents who'd begun organizing informally to support each other through testifying and documenting their
own experiences for the civil case Renata was simultaneously building on my behalf, seeking damages for the harassment campaign and attempted theft targeting Duke specifically.
I hesitated initially about pursuing civil damages beyond simply stopping the harassment, uncertain whether continuing legal action felt like justice or simply prolonged conflict I was tired of carrying. Renata gently reminded me that civil consequences often provided the only meaningful accountability in cases where criminal sentencing alone might feel insufficient to victims. I ultimately agreed to pursue the civil case, motivated less by financial compensation and more by ensuring Deborah's actions carried consequences severe enough to genuinely deter any future HOA leader, in Cedar Hollow or elsewhere, from believing they could weaponize community authority against a vulnerable homeowner without facing serious, lasting repercussions. December arrived with the trial date rapidly approaching, and I found myself alternating between anxious anticipation and a strange numbness, having lived inside this conflict so intensely for months that imagining actual resolution felt almost unreal. Duke, sensing my tension as always, stayed unusually close during those final preparation weeks before trial. Renata conducted a final comprehensive review of all evidence with me, walking through exactly how the trial would likely proceed, which questions I'd face, how to remain composed under potential defense cross-examination questioning my motives or characterizing my actions as disproportionate retaliation rather than legitimate self-protection against genuine, escalating threats. I practiced my testimony repeatedly with Renata's guidance, focusing on precise factual recounting rather than emotional appeals, understanding that the overwhelming documentary evidence, camera footage, financial records, witness statements, spoke powerfully on its own without requiring dramatic embellishment from my personal account of the sustained harassment I'd endured. Josh helped me develop specific grounding techniques for the witness stand itself. Small physical anchors like pressing my feet firmly against the floor or feeling Duke's collar tag in my pocket. Subtle reminders connecting me back to the present moment whenever testimony might threaten to pull me into overwhelming memories of genuine fear. Ellis, Carla, Frank, and Walter each finalized their own witness preparations separately with Renata's associates, the four of them representing different facets of Deborah's sustained pattern of abuse, historical context, financial fraud, board intimidation, and hired enforcement respectively, together painting a comprehensive picture no single account alone could have fully conveyed. The week before trial, I received an unexpected message through Renata from Deborah's defense attorney, floating a potential plea agreement that would resolve criminal charges without full trial testimony in exchange for reduced sentencing recommendations. Renata explained the decision ultimately rested partly with prosecutors and partly with my own preference regarding testifying. I discussed the potential plea agreement extensively with Renata, Josh, and even Ellis over dinner, weighing the emotional relief of avoiding difficult courtroom testimony against my strong desire to see the full extent of Deborah's actions formally, publicly acknowledged rather than quietly resolved through negotiated terms behind closed doors. Ultimately, The prosecutor's office decided the case's severity, particularly the attempted theft using hired individuals with fake credentials, warranted proceeding to full trial. Rather than accepting a plea deal that might understate the true scope of Deborah's sustained criminal conduct across nearly 7 years of financial fraud and community intimidation. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in mid-December. The county courthouse unusually crowded with Cedar Hollow residents who'd taken time off work specifically to witness proceedings that had consumed their community's attention for months. I sat beside Renata, Duke waiting patiently at home with Ellis, who'd volunteered immediately without hesitation. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the case methodically. Years of financial fraud disguised as fiscal stewardship, a fabricated enforcement committee wielding fake authority, and finally, an attempted theft using hired men with a documented history of criminal impersonation, all converging around one veteran homeowner and his rescue dog who'd simply refused to comply quietly. Deborah's defense attorney countered by emphasizing her genuine grief following her husband's death, her years of otherwise dedicated community service, and characterizing the reserve fund transfers as mismanagement rather than malice, attempting to reframe 7 years of documented fraud as understandable human failing rather than calculated, sustained criminal conduct against her neighbors. My testimony came on the second day, and despite months of preparation, walking to the witness stand still felt like stepping into unfamiliar combat. My heart pounding as I raised my hand to swear an oath I'd never imagined needing regarding something as seemingly mundane as my own dog's right to exist peacefully. I recounted the timeline steadily. The initial fabricated committee, the certified letters, the fake badges, the threatening by whatever means necessary note, and finally the morning Ray Doggett appeared at my gate claiming false authority. Renata's careful preparation held firm. I answered every question factually, without embellishment, letting the evidence speak clearly. During cross-examination, Deborah's attorney attempted to characterize my legal response as disproportionate, suggesting a simple compliance with initial pet weight restrictions might have avoided the entire conflict entirely. I calmly explained the accommodation letter, Dr. Alvarez's assessment, and my legal right to keep Duke, refusing to accept blame for enforcing my own rights. The attorney then pivoted, questioning why I'd installed extensive camera systems, implying paranoid overreaction rather than reasonable precaution. I simply described, in precise chronological detail, the escalating pattern of threats that had preceded each security decision, letting the documented timeline itself demonstrate exactly why such precautions had been entirely, tragically necessary. Ellis testified next, describing Deborah's decade-long pattern of targeting vulnerable homeowners, the young couple over the basketball hoop, the family over the wind chime, painting a portrait of sustained, deliberate intimidation rather than isolated overzealous enforcement. His calm, grandfatherly credibility clearly resonated deeply with several visibly moved jury members throughout his testimony. Carla testified remotely, describing her own family's identical experience 2 years earlier with the exact same fake enforcement badges, corroborating the pattern's longevity and establishing that Deborah's tactics against me weren't a unique escalation but a repeated, refined strategy she'd successfully employed against multiple families over an extended period of years. Frank's testimony focused heavily on the financial evidence, walking the jury methodically through years of reserve fund transfers, the non-existent Whitfield Property Solutions entity, and the mounting personal financial pressure that had apparently motivated the entire scheme. His accountant's precision made the complex fraud accessible and, importantly, thoroughly undeniable to any reasonable observer. Walter's testimony proved particularly powerful, describing firsthand the culture of intimidation within the board itself. Admitting his own unwitting participation in co-signing fraudulent transfers, and recounting overhearing Deborah's explicit instructions to hire no-nonsense guys for handling the dog situation. Language that directly contradicted her defense's characterization of confused, grieving mismanagement. Curtis, testifying under a cooperation agreement, delivered perhaps the trial's most damning testimony, describing in detail the cash payment, Deborah's explicit instructions to remove Duke, by force if necessary, and his own growing unease that ultimately led him to cooperate fully rather than face additional charges alongside Ray Doggett's more extensive criminal history.
Regarding Duke's genuine temperament, presenting her professional behavioral assessment and firmly refuting any characterization of him as dangerous, noting that the entire dangerous animal designation had originated from a single, deliberately misrepresented incident involving a child who himself, through his mother's own statement, confirmed Duke had done nothing wrong.
Tyler's mother testified as well, describing her genuine confusion upon learning Deborah had used the minor collision to formally accuse Duke of attacking her son, emphasizing that Tyler had actually enjoyed petting Duke afterward and had never expressed any fear of him whatsoever, directly contradicting the incident report's fabricated characterization entirely. The cumulative weight of testimony across multiple witnesses, financial records, camera footage, and expert assessments created an overwhelming, cohesive narrative that Deborah's defense attorney struggled visibly to counter effectively, each attempted reframing undermined by another piece of independent, corroborating evidence establishing the same essential pattern of calculated fraud and intimidation. Detective Ramirez testified regarding the investigation's law enforcement dimension, describing Ray Doggett's prior impersonation conviction, the failed seizure attempt captured on my camera footage, and the immediate arrest that had followed once responding officers confirmed neither man possessed legitimate animal control credentials of any kind whatsoever. The prosecution played my camera footage for the jury directly, the actual recording of Ray Doggett and Curtis at my gate, my calm but firm demands for identification, and their visible faltering once confronted with the active restraining order's existence. Watching it replayed in the courtroom felt strangely disorienting. Reliving that morning publicly, several jury members, I noticed, watched the footage with visible discomfort, particularly the moment Doggett claimed his identification was in the vehicle before ultimately having no legitimate credentials whatsoever. The recording's calm, methodical clarity, exactly as Renata had originally hoped, spoke far more powerfully than any dramatic courtroom recreation possibly could have. Deborah's own testimony, when she eventually took the stand in her defense, proved surprisingly brittle under sustained cross-examination. Her carefully rehearsed explanations about protecting community standards and financial mismanagement rather than theft, crumbling steadily against the prosecution's methodical, document-by-document dismantling of her narrative across nearly 2 hours of pointed questioning. At one particularly tense moment, the prosecutor asked Deborah directly why she'd instructed Ray Doggett and Curtis to remove Duke, by whatever means necessary, if her intentions had genuinely been limited to legitimate safety enforcement. Deborah's composure finally cracked visibly, her voice rising defensively as she insisted she'd never meant it literally. The prosecutor followed immediately by presenting Curtis's detailed cooperation testimony describing Deborah's explicit instructions to just take the dog if I refused to comply willingly, language that directly contradicted her claim of merely rhetorical intent. Deborah had no adequate response, sitting silently for several uncomfortably long seconds before the judge prompted her to answer. Watching her finally struggle for words after months of controlled, confident public performances felt like witnessing a genuinely significant shift. Not vindictive satisfaction exactly, but a profound sense that the truth, meticulously documented and patiently pursued, had finally caught up completely with someone who'd spent years believing herself entirely untouchable within her small kingdom. Closing arguments arrived on the fourth day of trial, the prosecution emphasizing the cohesive, undeniable pattern spanning financial fraud, fabricated authority, and attempted theft, while the defense made a final, somewhat desperate appeal to jury sympathy regarding Deborah's grief and genuine, if severely misguided, belief in her own community leadership. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning with verdicts on all counts. Guilty of criminal impersonation conspiracy. Guilty of attempted theft. Guilty of financial fraud exceeding $100,000. And guilty of violating the protective order through her hired agent's documented attempted seizure of my property. I sat perfectly still as the verdicts were read aloud one by one, Renata's steady hand briefly resting on my shoulder, feeling months of accumulated fear, exhaustion, and careful documentation finally resolve into something concrete and undeniable, a formal, public, legal acknowledgement that everything Duke and I had endured had genuinely, provably happened. Deborah's face, I noticed from across the courtroom, showed no dramatic reaction, just a kind of hollow stillness, as though some part of her had already anticipated this outcome despite months of defiant public performance. Her attorney requested a brief recess before sentencing discussions, which the judge granted without objection from either side. Sentencing was scheduled separately for several weeks later, allowing time for a full pre-sentence investigation report, though the judge noted during the recess that the jury's comprehensive, guilty verdicts across multiple serious felony counts would likely warrant significant incarceration time given the sustained, calculated nature of the documented criminal conduct. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, surrounded by Ellis, Carla, Frank, and Walter, all of whom had traveled significant distances or rearranged their entire schedules, specifically to witness this moment together, I felt overwhelmed by a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and profound gratitude for people who'd stood beside me throughout. Renata hugged me briefly outside the courthouse, something she later admitted wasn't typical professional practice but felt entirely appropriate given everything we'd navigated together over the preceding months. "You built this case as much as I did," she said. "Every piece of documentation, every calm decision under pressure, that was you." I called Josh that evening to share the verdict, and he reminded me gently that legal vindication, while important, wasn't the same as full emotional resolution, that processing months of sustained fear and hypervigilance would likely continue requiring conscious effort even now that the acute external threat had finally, definitively passed. Driving home from the courthouse, I picked up Duke from Ellis's house, and his overjoyed greeting, oblivious entirely to the legal drama that had defined our recent months together, felt like the purest possible reminder of exactly what all of this had been about protecting from the very beginning of this ordeal. That night, sitting on my porch with Duke's head resting heavily against my leg, I allowed myself, finally, to fully exhale, watching the quiet darkness settle over Magnolia Court, a neighborhood that had nearly destroyed my peace entirely but was now, slowly, beginning to rebuild something genuinely healthier from its own hard-won wreckage. News of the guilty verdicts spread rapidly beyond Cedar Hollow itself. The local blogger who'd first covered the story publishing a detailed follow-up that quickly gained wider regional attention, prompting several other homeowners association watchdog groups across Georgia to reach out, curious whether similar patterns existed within their own communities. I received messages from strangers in other states describing eerily similar HOA power struggles, controlling board presidents, fabricated committees, threatened pet surrenders, and found myself, somewhat unexpectedly, becoming an informal resource for others navigating comparable conflicts, sharing Renata's contact information and general guidance about documentation and legal escalation strategies. Renata, meanwhile, began preparing formally for the separate civil lawsuit, now significantly strengthened by the criminal trial's comprehensive public record, seeking damages on behalf of myself and, with their consent, Carla and several other former Cedar Hollow residents who'd experienced similar harassment during Deborah's decade-long presidency over the association. The civil case moved considerably faster than the criminal proceedings, Deborah's attorney recommending a settlement given the overwhelming criminal conviction record now firmly established. Negotiations concluded within several weeks, resulting in a substantial settlement covering my legal fees, emotional distress damages, and a formal, binding acknowledgement of wrongdoing specifically regarding Duke. Similar settlements followed for Carla and two other former residents who joined the civil action, though Renata cautioned that Deborah's actual remaining assets, significantly diminished by mounting legal fees, frozen accounts, and the substantial second mortgage Ellis had heard about earlier, meant full financial recovery would likely take considerable additional time to materialize completely. Cedar Hollow's interim board, now formally elected as permanent leadership following a genuinely contested election for the first time in over a decade, continued implementing the governance reforms I'd advocated for earlier, formally codifying protections against any future president wielding unchecked committee formation or enforcement authority without full board and homeowner approval. Frank was elected board president in that new election, running unopposed not through manipulation but through genuine, earned community trust built during months of quiet, courageous cooperation with investigators despite significant personal risk. His first official act was commissioning a full independent financial audit covering the entirety of Deborah's decade-long tenure. That audit, completed over several months, ultimately confirmed the full scope of financial mismanagement and fraud, providing Cedar Hollow with a clear, documented understanding of exactly how deeply Deborah's unchecked authority had damaged the community's finances, knowledge the new board used specifically to rebuild transparent, accountable governance moving forward. I attended Frank's inauguration as board president, watching him address a packed clubhouse with genuine humility rather than Deborah's practiced theatrical authority, promising transparent governance and explicitly thanking the neighbors, myself, Carla, Ellis, and Walter included, whose collective courage had ultimately made this entire transformation possible for Cedar Hollow. Sentencing day arrived in late January, nearly 7 months after Deborah's first suspicious visit to my door regarding Duke's weight. The courtroom was again crowded with Cedar Hollow residents, though this time the atmosphere felt distinctly different. Less anxious anticipation and more quiet. Collective closure after such a genuinely exhausting ordeal. Renata and the prosecution jointly recommended a sentence reflecting the sustained, calculated nature of Deborah's conduct. 7 years of financial fraud, a fabricated enforcement scheme, and ultimately an attempted theft involving hired criminals, arguing that meaningful consequences were essential not just for accountability but for genuine deterrence within HOA governance broadly. The judge, in delivering sentencing, specifically noted the particularly troubling nature of weaponizing homeowners association authority to target a disabled veteran and his service animal, calling it a profound betrayal of the trust and responsibility inherent in community leadership positions, language that resonated powerfully throughout the packed courtroom. Deborah was sentenced to 8 years in state prison on the combined felony counts, with eligibility for parole review after serving a mandatory minimum portion, alongside restitution orders requiring repayment of the full defrauded reserve fund amount and additional civil settlement obligations already established through the earlier negotiated agreements. Watching Deborah led away in restraints following sentencing, I felt none of the triumphant satisfaction I might have imagined months earlier during the darkest points of our conflict. Only a heavy, complicated exhaustion and quiet relief that this specific chapter, finally, completely, had reached its genuine, undeniable conclusion. Ray Doggett, given his prior impersonation conviction and central role in the attempted seizure, received a separate but similarly significant sentence for his own criminal charges, while Curtis, due to his substantial cooperation throughout the investigation, received a considerably reduced sentence involving probation and community service rather than incarceration. Walter, though never criminally charged given his unwitting participation and extensive cooperation, resigned permanently from any future HOA involvement, telling me privately that the entire experience had taught him more about the quiet dangers of unchecked authority than he'd ever expected to learn from something as seemingly mundane as neighborhood governance. I gave a brief statement to the local blogger following sentencing, careful once again to remain factual rather than triumphant, emphasizing the importance of documentation, legal advocacy, and community solidarity in confronting abuses of power wherever they occurred, rather than framing the outcome as personal victory over Deborah specifically. Duke, entirely unaware of courtrooms and sentencing hearings, simply continued his joyful daily rhythms, greeting neighbors on our walks, chasing his tennis ball across the backyard, resting his heavy head against my leg each evening, a living reminder of exactly what had been worth protecting throughout this exhausting 7-month ordeal. Cedar Hollow, in the weeks following sentencing, felt genuinely different. Neighbors greeting each other openly, community meetings functioning as actual collaborative forums rather than theatrical rubber stamp sessions, a palpable sense of collective relief and renewed trust slowly rebuilding across a neighborhood that had spent over a decade under quiet, controlling fear. I received a heartfelt note from Tyler's mother that week, thanking me for handling the entire situation with patience and grace despite everything, and enclosing a small drawing Tyler had made showing himself petting Duke, labeled simply "my friend," in careful, crooked 9-year-old handwriting that made me tear up unexpectedly. Ellis and I continued our regular porch dinners, Now free from the underlying tension that had colored our early conversations months earlier, simply enjoying genuine neighborly friendship built through an unexpectedly intense shared ordeal. Never thought Cedar Hollow would feel this normal again, he admitted one evening, raising his glass toward Duke. Carla visited Cedar Hollow in person for the first time since leaving years earlier, walking the old neighborhood with visible emotion, finally able to revisit a place that had once driven her family away through fear and financial harassment, now genuinely welcoming under Frank's transparent, accountable new leadership and reformed governance structure. Frank invited me to formally join the newly reformed HOA Board's Advisory Committee, specifically to help ensure the accommodation and disability rights protections I'd fought so hard for became permanently, explicitly codified within Cedar Hollow's governing documents, protections that would outlast any single leader's tenure or personal biases moving forward. I accepted, somewhat reluctantly at first, wary of remaining too deeply entangled with HOA governance after everything Duke and I had endured, but ultimately recognizing an opportunity to ensure no future homeowner, disabled or otherwise vulnerable, would face what we'd survived without existing structural protections already firmly in place beforehand. Walter's civil cooperation, combined with the completed independent financial audit, ultimately helped Cedar Hollow recover a meaningful portion of the defrauded reserve funds through Deborah's restitution obligations and remaining seized assets, funds the new board allocated transparently toward deferred maintenance projects that had been neglected throughout her decade-long tenure. I watched, over subsequent months, as the community pool finally received long-overdue repairs. The entrance sign I'd once repainted got properly restored with updated lighting, and the neglected walking trails behind the clubhouse were finally cleared and maintained. Tangible physical evidence of transparent governance actually serving the entire community's genuine needs. Duke's limp, remarkably, improved noticeably that spring. Dr. Alvarez noting during a routine checkup that reduced stress hormones, evident in his overall demeanor and mobility, likely contributed alongside his ongoing physical therapy exercises. A small but meaningful reminder that the sustained anxiety of our ordeal had genuinely affected him too. I found myself reflecting often, during quiet evening walks with Duke through a neighborhood that finally felt safe again, on everything the entire experience had taught me about persistence, documentation, and the quiet courage required to challenge entrenched, unchecked power even when doing so felt exhausting, isolating, and genuinely frightening throughout. Josh and I discussed, during one support group session, how the entire ordeal had paralleled certain aspects of my earlier military service. Not the danger itself exactly, but the discipline required to stay methodical and composed while under sustained pressure. Gathering intelligence patiently rather than reacting impulsively to genuine provocation. Renata and I remained in occasional contact even after the case fully concluded, and she mentioned, months later, that our case had become something of a reference point she cited when advising other clients facing similar HOA power abuses. A concrete example demonstrating that patient, methodical documentation could ultimately overcome even entrenched authority. I began, at Frank's encouragement, sharing my documentation strategy informally with other homeowners association watchdog groups across Georgia, careful never to offer specific legal advice beyond Renata's professional guidance, but genuinely hoping my own hard-won experience might help others recognize similar warning signs earlier in their own community's governance patterns. Carla and I stayed close friends, following everything we'd navigated together, occasionally meeting for coffee to simply talk about ordinary things, our friendship no longer solely defined by shared trauma but genuinely enriched by the mutual respect and trust built through standing together against something neither of us could have successfully confronted entirely alone. Ellis, watching Duke and me on our evening walk one warm spring evening, remarked that Cedar Hollow finally felt like the neighborhood he remembered from decades earlier, before Deborah's controlling ascension had quietly transformed genuine community into something closer to fearful compliance disguised as orderly, well-maintained suburban harmony. I thought often, during that healing spring, about how close everything had come to a genuinely tragic outcome, how easily a single confrontation at my gate that Saturday morning could have escalated into physical violence rather than a documented, ultimately successful legal intervention. Grateful beyond words for the cameras, the timing, the accumulated preparation. Duke's second anniversary since his rescue arrived that April, and I marked the occasion with a small celebration on my porch. Ellis, Frank, and Carla joining me, toasting not just Duke's remarkable resilience but the genuine community solidarity that had ultimately protected him when fabricated authority had attempted to take him away entirely. Walter sent a card that week too, though he'd stepped back from active community involvement, simply thanking me for never once blaming him personally for his unwitting participation in Deborah's schemes, understanding intimately how fear and intimidation could compromise even fundamentally decent people caught within genuinely toxic systems of unchecked authority. I reflected, during a quiet moment alone with Duke that evening, on Renata's earlier observation that bullies rarely stopped voluntarily, that meaningful accountability required sustained, patient, methodical pressure rather than a single decisive confrontation, a lesson that had ultimately proven true across every stage of this exhausting 7-month ordeal together. Cedar Hollow's reformed governance structure, now fully codified within updated bylaws, included specific provisions I'd personally advocated for: mandatory disability accommodation review processes, prohibition against any unelected committee claiming enforcement authority, and required annual independent financial audits. Structural protections designed to prevent this exact scenario from ever recurring again. Frank continued serving as an unusually transparent, consensus-driven board president, regularly soliciting homeowner feedback before major decisions. A stark contrast to Deborah's decade of unilateral control that most Cedar Hollow residents had simply, sadly, accepted as normal until circumstances finally forced genuine, comprehensive scrutiny upon the entire association's governance. I watched Tyler, now approaching his 10th birthday, continue growing up genuinely fond of Duke, occasionally helping walk him around the block when his mother allowed it, an innocent friendship entirely untouched by the elaborate legal and financial drama his brief, accidental collision with Duke had inadvertently helped fully expose. Reflecting on everything, I recognized the entire ordeal had ultimately revealed something larger than one woman's individual cruelty or desperation, a broader pattern of unchecked institutional authority, however small in scale, capable of causing genuine harm when neither transparency nor accountability existed to meaningfully constrain it within any community. The following autumn, exactly 1 year after Deborah's initial suspicious visit regarding Duke's weight, Cedar Hollow held its annual community celebration, now genuinely festive, rather than performatively organized. Neighbors gathering warmly across a neighborhood finally healed from over a decade of quiet, controlling fear disguised as orderly governance. I attended with Duke, now fully recovered both physically and, as much as any dog could convey, emotionally from our shared ordeal, watching him greet neighbors and children alike with his characteristic unguarded joy, a living testament to resilience that mirrored, in its own way, our entire community's gradual healing process. Renata joined us briefly at the celebration, having become something between attorney and genuine friend throughout our extended case, watching Duke work the crowd for attention with visible amusement. Never thought I'd end a major case by attending a dog's celebrity appearance at a neighborhood picnic, she laughed warmly. Deborah, meanwhile, began serving her sentence at a state correctional facility, her restitution obligations slowly being processed through automatic wage garnishment from prison work programs. Her once-controlled kingdom on Magnolia Court now governed by transparent, accountable leadership that had emerged directly from her own catastrophic, calculated abuse of power. I received one final piece of news from Renata that autumn. Deborah's home on Magnolia Court, unable to sustain mortgage payments given her frozen assets and mounting legal obligations, had entered foreclosure proceedings. The largest house in the neighborhood she'd once ruled absolutely now standing empty, awaiting eventual sale to new owners. Standing on my porch that evening, watching the sunset paint Magnolia Court in warm autumn colors, Duke resting contentedly beside me, I felt genuine, complete peace for the first time since this entire ordeal began. A hard-won stillness earned through persistence, documentation, and a community that had ultimately chosen courage over fear. Cedar Hollow today functions as the neighborhood I originally believed I was moving into. Transparent, genuinely welcoming, governed by people accountable to their neighbors rather than fear. Duke still walks our familiar loop each evening, greeted warmly by name, his limp long faded, his tail wagging as steadily as ever before. I still keep that thick binder of documentation in my home office, no longer needed legally but preserved as a reminder that quiet persistence, careful evidence, and genuine community solidarity can ultimately overcome even the most entrenched, unchecked abuse of power, however powerless the situation may feel in its darkest moments. Some evenings, watching Tyler race Duke across the community green while Frank and Ellis wave from their porches, I think about how close we came to losing everything, and how a fabricated badge, a forged signature, and one woman's desperate cruelty ultimately built the very evidence that set us free. The END.